Coffee rebels, the 16th century outlaw cafes of Mecca. Hey guys. Tonight we're going to drift back a few centuries into the world of forbidden drinks, late night gatherings, and men who thought sipping a hot, bitter liquid was basically an act of revolution. So dim your lights, settle into whatever strange sleeping position works for you, and let's glide into the story of Mecca's outlaw coffeehouses. Yes, coffee. The thing you probably guzzled 3 times today to stay awake at work. And the same thing I'm now telling you about, while also hoping you fall asleep. Life is full of contradictions. But long before Starbucks and pumpkin spice season, coffee was seen as suspicious, intoxicating, and slightly scandalous, especially in the holy city of Mecca in the 1500s. So let's start with the basics. Coffee as a drink didn't just appear out of nowhere. It had roots in Ethiopia, where legend claims a goat herder noticed his goats bouncing around energetically. After chewing on some strange red berries, he thought, interesting, these goats are having a better time than me. And, as usual in human history, curiosity plus boredom equals invention. People eventually began brewing the seeds of those berries into a drink. By the late 1400s, this little experiment had traveled across the Red Sea into Yemen. From there, the Sufi mystics really made coffee their thing. Now, the Sufis weren't just drinking coffee because they liked the taste, though honestly, early coffee probably tasted like boiled mulch. They drank it because it kept them awake during all-night religious chanting and meditation. Imagine it, a group of mystics in Yemen, swaying, chanting prayers, and passing around steaming cups of this bitter black liquid. It was holy caffeine, divine espresso, God's energy drink. By the early 1500s, coffee made its way into Mecca, the beating spiritual heart of Islam. And here's where things got complicated. You'd think a holy city would embrace a drink that helped people stay up all night praying. But no. Instead, Mecca's authorities thought coffee was sketchy. Very sketchy. Let's pause for a second. Why would anyone look at coffee, something that just makes you a little less sleepy, and say, this is dangerous? Well, part of it was that coffee houses quickly became more than just places to drink. They were social spaces. People sat together, exchanged stories, discussed poetry, debated religion, maybe gossiped about politics. Basically, they were the 16th century version of Twitter, but with better lighting and fewer billionaires ruining everything. This terrified the authorities, because nothing frightens rulers more than people sitting together, caffeinated and talking. Wine was easy, drunk people just passed out. But coffee drinkers, they were alert, they were opinionated, and worst of all, they remembered what you said the next morning. So, by around 1511, Mecca's governor, a man named Beg, decided to take action. He was a classic example of the grumpy official who doesn't like fun archetype. Beg saw people drinking coffee late into the night, hanging out in smoky cafes, and getting a little too chatty about religion and politics, he thought. Nope, this is chaos. Can't have people thinking and talking that might threaten my power. Naturally, he declared coffee illegal. Yes, really, coffee, outlawed. Imagine living in a world where your morning latte is contraband. But that was Mecca in 1511. Beg didn't just say coffee was banned, he made it dramatic. He gathered legal scholars and asked them to declare coffee intoxicating, like wine, which was already forbidden under Islamic law. The scholars were hesitant. They weren't exactly convinced. After all, coffee didn't make you drunk. It made you awake. At worst, It made you jittery and talk too fast. But Care Beg insisted, because when you're a governor and you want something banned, you don't really need logic. You just need power and a few nervous scholars willing to nod. So coffee was outlawed, the cafes of Mecca were shut down, and in a move that would make modern Instagram influencers cry, giant piles of coffee beans were burned in the streets. Imagine the smell, not the cozy aroma of your morning brew, but the acrid stench of raw beans roasting in giant smoky heaps. All wasted. But here's the thing, banning coffee didn't really work. People loved it too much. It wasn't like wine, where you needed vineyards and fermentation. Coffee could be smuggled, roasted in little batches, and brewed quietly at home. So while the authorities declared war on coffee, the people of Mecca basically shrugged and said, sure, we'll stop drinking it. And then they went right back to drinking it. And here's where things get even more ironic. The Sultan in Cairo, who was technically Care Beg's boss, heard about this whole ban, and he was not impressed. In fact, he loved coffee. So when word got back to him that Care Beg was making bonfires of beans and scaring people away from cafes, he basically said, are you kidding me? Let the people drink their coffee. And so, the ban was lifted almost as quickly as it began. Care Beg was humiliated. He'd tried to look like the moral guardian of Mecca, but instead he looked like the guy who took away everyone's favorite drink and then got smacked down by his boss. Not exactly a career highlight. Still, the suspicion around coffee didn't just vanish overnight. For decades afterward, scholars and rulers across the Ottoman Empire debated whether coffee was acceptable. Some argued it was too stimulating, that it encouraged late-night idleness and radical thinking. Others pointed out that it was basically just a bean tea, hardly sinful. These debates went back and forth, like a centuries-long Reddit thread, where nobody ever changes their mind. Meanwhile, coffee houses were spreading like wildfire. Cairo, Istanbul, Damascus, all had thriving cafe cultures by the mid-1500s. They weren't just about coffee either. People went there for music, for board games, for poetry, recitals. They became cultural hubs, especially for men who wanted a space outside of the home. And of course, they remained political hotspots. If you wanted to hear rumors about the Sultan, you went to the coffee house. If you wanted to debate theology, you went to the coffee house. If you just wanted to complain about taxes, well, you guessed it, coffee house. And that brings us to one of the strangest twists in this story. The authorities who hated coffee houses also secretly relied on them. Police spies would hang out in cafes, eavesdropping on conversations, listening for anyone plotting rebellion or criticizing the government. Imagine sitting there with your cup of coffee, whispering about politics, and not realizing the guy at the next table was literally paid to listen and report on you. It's basically the 16th century version of government surveillance. But again, the irony here is thick. The more the authorities tried to crack down on coffee houses, the more popular they became. There's just something irresistible about a forbidden drink. People don't line up for a loud juice. They line up for the thing that was once burned in bonfires in the holy city. Now, let's take a little side note here, because the paranoia about coffee wasn't unique to the Islamic world. When coffee eventually spread to Europe in the 1600s, it sparked its own wave of suspicion. In England, coffee houses were called penny universities because you could sit for the price of a cup and hear endless discussions and debates. And, just like in Mecca, governments didn't love that. King Charles II of England even tried. to ban coffee houses in 1675 because he was tired of people gossiping about him over cappuccinos. Again, it didn't work. People love their caffeine more than they love their kings. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Let's float back to Mecca in the 1500s. Coffee is technically legal again, but it still carries a faint whiff of rebellion. The cafes are crowded, the authorities are uneasy, and the Sufis keep sipping their brew for long nights of chanting. And here's the dreamy, almost funny contrast I want to leave you with in this first stretch of the story. In a city defined by ritual, by prayer, by tradition, the most scandalous thing you could do in the early 1500s was drink a hot bean juice at midnight with your friends. No riots, no weapons, no sedition pamphlets. Just men sitting on cushions, sipping, talking, and staying awake a little longer than the authorities thought was decent. That's the quiet little rebellion of the coffee drinkers of Mecca, and it's why. Centuries later, you can stumble into a cafe at 2 a.m, order an espresso, and know you're participating in a tradition that once made governors panic. But of course, we're not done. Because coffee wasn't just a drink, it became a cultural force. It would fuel empires, it would spark more bands, and it would eventually conquer the entire globe. And yes, it would also give us pumpkin spice lattes. But we'll save that horror for another time. For now, take another slow breath. Let's glide forward from the holy city of Mecca to Cairo, where the smoky dens of coffee drinkers grew even rowdier and even harder to control. Cairo's smoky dens and Ottoman crackdowns. So we left Mecca behind. Picture the quiet alleys, the extinguished bean bonfires, the governor sulking in his quarters because his boss told him off. And now we glide up the Red Sea, over the deserts and fertile banks of the Nile, until we settle into the hazy, buzzing sprawl of Cairo in the 1500s. If Mecca was where coffee became controversial, Cairo was where it became unstoppable. By this time, Cairo was one of the most important cities in the Islamic world, a crossroads of trade, scholarship, and religion. And in the middle of all this, coffee houses began popping up everywhere, not just one or two tucked into side streets. We're talking dozens, then hundreds. A whole cityscape of smoky dens where men gathered, steaming cups in hand. Now, these weren't the sleek cafes you might be picturing. There were no polished espresso machines, no chalkboard menus with pumpkin spice flat white. Cairo's 16th century coffee houses were often dim little rooms, smoky with braziers, cushions scattered on the floor, and the constant rattle of cups. The walls might be bare, the lighting mostly oil lamps, and the smell, well, let's be honest, a blend of scorched coffee, sweat, dust, and incense. Not exactly Parisian chic, but to the people of Cairo, it was intoxicating. Coffee houses became the city's heartbeat. They were places of escape from the home, and remember, home life in a crowded medieval city wasn't exactly peaceful. Families crammed together in small spaces, noise spilling from every wall. A cafe offered a small pocket of air, a little retreat where men could lounge, smoke a pipe, sip their coffee, and gossip about the day's events. And oh, the gossip. Politics, religion, scandal, poetry, rumors of war, complaints about taxes. In many ways, the coffee house was more powerful than the mosque or the market because it was the one place where words flowed freely. And that was both exciting and terrifying, depending on who you asked. Authorities, of course, were not thrilled. They had already watched the Mecca fiasco with its bean burnings and its embarrassing reversal. But Cairo's rulers were equally nervous about what coffeehouses represented. It wasn't the drink itself, although people still argued about whether it counted as intoxicating. It was the conversations, the sense that people were gathering outside of official spaces, creating their own kind of public sphere. Think of it this way: rulers loved having control over when and where people could gather. Mosques, markets, festivals, all of those had structure, hierarchy, and rules. But a coffeehouse that was unpredictable. You could walk in and find a group of poets reciting love verses, or a group of merchants angrily debating tax policies. And once you give people a space to talk freely, it's only a matter of time before they start questioning the people in charge. And yet, Cairo's coffeehouses kept spreading. Why? Because people adored them. Coffee offered something new in a world that had mostly relied on alcohol for social lubrication. But alcohol was forbidden, at least officially, under Islamic law. Coffee, however, existed in this strange grey area. Some scholars said it was fine, others frowned and muttered about intoxication. But it was never completely banned in Egypt the way Kerbeg had tried in Mecca. So coffeehouses thrived, operating in that perfect liminal space, technically suspicious, but not illegal. And of course, the Sufis were there too, chanting late into the night. Cups of coffee lined up beside them, the spiritual energy of coffee mixed with the social buzz, and suddenly Cairo was wide awake. Nights grew longer, streets stayed alive, and people discovered that caffeine could carry them through hours of talk and thought they never would have managed otherwise. But, as always, where there is joy, there are crackdowns. The Ottoman Empire had taken control of Egypt in 1517, right after the whole Mecca coffee debacle. And the Ottomans, like any large empire, were both fascinated and wary of coffeehouses. On one hand, they liked coffee themselves. Many officials were secretly addicted to it. On the other hand, they saw how these spaces could breed unrest. It was like watching a fire and thinking, that looks warm and cozy, but it could also burn my entire house down. So, in Cairo, the authorities sometimes tried to rein things in. Edicts were issued warning coffeehouse owners to behave. Police patrolled the streets, checking for illegal gatherings. But the truth was, shutting down Cairo's coffee culture was like trying to hold water in your hands. The more you squeezed, the more it slipped through your fingers. And let's not forget the economic side. Coffee had become big business. Yemen was exporting beans, merchants were making fortunes, and cafe owners were paying taxes. Once the economy is hooked on something, it becomes very hard for governments to eliminate it, no matter how suspicious. They feel Cairo's coffeehouses weren't just cultural hubs, they were money machines, and money always wins. Now, one of the things that really made Cairo's cafes thrive was entertainment. These weren't silent, monkish places where people just sipped and stared at the wall. They were noisy, vibrant, full of life. Storytellers performed epics about warriors and lovers. Musicians played the oud or recited poetry. Sometimes there were shadow puppet shows projected against walls. Basically, these coffeehouses were the Netflix of their time, but live. And with fewer subscription fees, this entertainment made them even more irresistible. Imagine you're a tired merchant after a long day in the bazaar. You could go home to a crowded, noisy house, or you could wander into a cafe, sip some hot coffee, and listen to a storyteller spin a tale of great kings and battles while smoke curls lazily in the air. No contest. But again, the rulers looked at this with suspicion, because storytelling could easily slip into satire. Musicians could mock local officials in veiled lyrics. Shadow puppets could lampoon government policy. And once again, you have a situation where too much caffeine plus too much creativity equals too much political risk. So, the cycle repeated. People loved coffee, rulers tried to crack down, bans or warnings were issued, and the coffeehouses kept thriving anyway. By the late 1500s, coffee had become so firmly embedded in Cairo's culture that no ban could ever remove it. The people had tasted it, and there was no going back. And here's a little irony to save us slowly. In a city that was technically one of the most conservative and religious in the world, some of the most subversive conversations were happening. In dim little rooms filled with smoke and bitter black liquid, Cairo's spiritual heart beat in the mosque. Yes, but its social brain was buzzing in the cafes. Let's pause here and think about the rhythm of all this. Coffee was spreading not because it was extraordinary, but because it was ordinary, because it fit so perfectly into the human need for connection, for stimulation, for stories. Nobody sits down and says, I want to commit a cultural revolution tonight. They just want a cup of coffee, some company, and maybe a good story. And before you know it, that simple ritual reshapes entire cities. Of course, Cairo was only the beginning. The Ottoman Empire had far bigger cities than this, and far bigger problems with people gathering to talk. So, while Cairo cafes settled into daily life, Istanbul, the grand capital of the Ottomans, was about to explode with coffee culture. And with that explosion would come some of the harshest crackdowns yet. But let's not rush. Before we float north to Istanbul, let's linger for a moment in Cairo's smoky air. Picture the crowded lanes outside, donkeys braying, merchants calling, the Nile breeze carrying scents of spice and dust. Inside, men recline on cushions, cups clinking, a storyteller weaving words into the night. Someone yawns, someone else leans forward, the coffee keeps flowing. And above it all, the quiet tension of a society both enchanted and unsettled by this strange new drink. That's Cairo, the city that embraced coffee even when its rulers wrung their hands. The city that proved you can't fight caffeine with laws. And now we drift onward. The Bosporus waits, the domes of Istanbul glimmer in the distance, and another round of coffee bans is brewing. Because if Cairo's rulers were uneasy, Istanbul's sultans were downright paranoid. Istanbul's coffee obsession and the paranoid sultan. So we leave Cairo behind. The Nile fades into the distance, the desert sands fall away, and the sea opens before us. Our little coffee-scented breeze drifts north, crossing the waves, slipping through the Bosporus, and finally settling into the grandest city of the 16th century. Istanbul, the Ottomans liked to call it the center of the world, and in many ways it was. The empire stretched from Hungary to Arabia, from North Africa to the Black Sea. Trade routes, armies, ideas, all flowed through this glittering capital. And in the middle of all that grandeur, in the shadow of the Sultan's palace, coffee arrived now. Istanbul was not a city that did anything halfway. If Cairo had dozens of coffee houses, Istanbul had hundreds, maybe thousands. Coffee arrived in the mid-1500s, and within a generation the city was buzzing, literally buzzing, because the people were all caffeinated, and just as in Mecca and Cairo, the coffee house here became much more than a place to drink. These were elaborate establishments. Some were small and tucked into corners of neighborhoods. Others were sprawling halls, richly decorated, full of carpets and cushions. The smoke of braziers hung heavy in the air. Cups clinked. Pipes glowed. And everywhere, the hum of voices filled the space. If you want a modern comparison, think of a coffee house as a mashup of Starbucks Reddit, a dive bar, and a community center. You could walk into one and hear a merchant reading poetry, a group of janissaries grumbling about their pay, a scholar debating theology, and two men playing backgammon in the corner. It was democracy, gossip, and performance art, all wrapped up in a cloud of smoke and caffeine. And for the Ottoman authorities, that was terrifying. Remember, Istanbul was the beating political heart of the empire. This was where the Sultan lived, where the bureaucracy hummed, where rebellions began and ended. And suddenly you had thousands of men gathering in cafes, talking, listening, criticizing, and plotting. It was like someone had invented a brand new printing press for rumors, and it ran entirely on beans, so naturally the sultans panicked. One of the first big bans came under Sultan Murad III, who reigned from 1574 to 1595. He looked around and saw that coffee houses had become breeding grounds for political chatter. He decided that was unacceptable. So he issued a decree. Coffee houses were to be closed. Anyone caught running, one could be punished. But, and this will sound familiar, the ban didn't work. People just loved coffee too much. They smuggled. It brewed it at home, opened secret cafes. The ban was ignored so openly that it became more of a joke than a law. So the Ottomans doubled down. Enter Sultan Murad IV, who reigned in the early 1600s. Now, Murad IV was not a man who messed around. He had a reputation for iron-fisted rule, and he absolutely hated coffee houses. To him, they were nests of sedition, places where disloyal soldiers and scheming bureaucrats whispered against him, so he went further than just banning them. He personally patrolled the streets of Istanbul in disguise. Yes, the Sultan himself, looking for people drinking coffee. If he caught them, the punishments could be brutal. Some stories even say he ordered executions for repeat offenders. Imagine that, being beheaded not for treason, not for rebellion, but for sipping a cappuccino at the wrong time. That was life under Murad IV. And yet, people still drank coffee. Because here's the thing, once a habit takes hold, once a city's culture revolves around something, no amount of terror can really root it out. People hid their cups, brewed at home, whispered over their beans. The coffee never stopped flowing. There's an almost comical irony in all of this. The Ottoman sultans feared coffee houses as dangerous breeding grounds of rebellion, but they themselves loved coffee. Court life was soaked in it. By the mid-1500s, the palace had an official title, the Kavesi Baka, literally the chief coffee maker. This was a trusted position, a servant who prepared coffee for the sultan himself. Imagine fearing that coffee might overthrow you, while also demanding a cup every morning from your royal barista. It's one of those contradictions that makes history so wonderfully human. You can ban something for the people while quietly enjoying it yourself. The classic, do as I say, not as I do. So, Istanbul lived in this constant cycle. Coffee houses were banned, then reopened, then banned again, then tolerated. The pendulum swung back and forth for decades. Sometimes rulers cracked down harshly. Sometimes they shrugged and looked the other way. But always, the coffee houses endured. And let's talk about what actually happened inside these places, because that's part of the magic. Coffee houses weren't just about drinking coffee. They were cultural stages. Storytellers, called medders, would perform long tales, epics of war, love, betrayal. They'd change voices for different characters, gesture dramatically, and pulled the audience into the story. Imagine a one-man Netflix show, live, with coffee instead of popcorn. Musicians were there too, strumming lutes, singing songs, reciting poems. There were games, chess, backgammon, checkers, and always the conversation, endless conversation, about religion, politics, gossip, family. For many men, the coffee house was the only place they could be heard, where they could sit and exchange ideas freely. This is why the authorities were nervous. Because once you have a place where people exchange ideas, you have a place where discontent grows. A janissary complains about his pay, a poet slips in a line mocking the sultan, a merchant grumbles about taxes. Suddenly the room is buzzing with dissent, and that buzz, multiplied by thousands of cafes, becomes a roar that rulers can't ignore. It's worth noting here that women were mostly excluded from this culture. Coffee houses were male-dominated spaces, reflections of a patriarchal society, where men occupied the public sphere and women were expected to remain in the private. Women did drink coffee at home. In fact, coffee became a huge part of domestic life. Some Ottoman women even argued that a husband who failed to provide coffee could be grounds for divorce. But the public coffee house remained a male sanctuary, a smoky fraternity of caffeine and chatter. Now, if all this sounds tense and dangerous, remember, it was also incredibly ordinary. Most people weren't plotting revolts in these places. They were just trying to pass the time, sip their drink, and enjoy a little entertainment. But history is full of moments where ordinary habits accidentally create extraordinary consequences, and coffee houses were one of those habits. By the late 1500s and early 1600s, the coffee house had become an institution in Istanbul. Foreign visitors were astonished. European travelers described entering these smoky dens and finding themselves swept into an entirely different world, a world of noise, energy, and caffeine. Some loved it, others were horrified. One English visitor sniffed that the drink tasted like soot and ditch water. But the people of Istanbul were hooked, and once the Ottomans embraced something, it spread across their empire like wildfire. Coffee houses appeared in Damascus, Aleppo, Baghdad. They popped up in Balkan cities, in North Africa, wherever Ottoman influence reached. Each place adapted the coffee house to its own culture, but the essentials were the same: a cup of coffee, a seat, and a conversation. So, by the early 17th century, what had begun as a suspicious Sufi drink in Yemen had become a central feature of one of the greatest empires in the world. And despite bans, despite patrols, despite punishments, the coffee house refused to die. It became the stubborn heartbeat of urban life, and here's where we can pause, take a deep breath, and appreciate the sleepy irony of it all. Imagine the Sultan sitting in his gilded palace, sipping his carefully brewed coffee from the hands of his chief coffee maker, while somewhere in the city, in a smoky cafe, a group of janissaries are doing the exact same thing, only with more complaints. The drink that united them was the same drink that divided them. That's Istanbul's coffee paradox. The authorities feared it, the people loved it, and in the end, the love won. But of course, the story doesn't end in Istanbul, because coffee wasn't content to stay in the Ottoman world. It slipped onto ships, crossed seas, and landed in Venice, Paris, and London. And when it did, it sparked the exact same debates all over again. Was it intoxicating? Was it sinful? Was it dangerous? And most importantly, who would profit from it? So let's float westward now, across the Mediterranean, where Venetian traders are unloading sacks of beans, and curious Europeans are about to discover what all the fuss is about. Spoiler, they will also panic, they will also ban it, and they will also fail. Because, once again, nobody can stop people from drinking their coffee. Venice, London, and Europe's coffee panic so. We've sipped through Mecca, drifted through Cairo, lounged in Istanbul, and now it's time to cross the sea. Picture Venetian galleys bobbing in the harbour, sacks of strange little beans being hauled ashore, and puzzled merchants sniffing at the new cargo. Coffee had finally made it to Europe. And, predictably, Europeans had no idea what to do with it. Venice was the first major European port to welcome coffee in the late 1500s. Venetian traders, always eager to make a profit off the Ottomans, brought back sacks of beans and introduced them to the city. At first, coffee was sold in apothecaries. That tells you something right away. It wasn't considered a casual drink. It was exotic, medicinal, suspicious. The kind of thing you'd try if your doctor told you it would fix your gout. Not the kind of thing you'd sip with a friend. And then, as always, came the moral panic. The Catholic Church was deeply suspicious of this bitter, dark drink. Some priests whispered that coffee was the bitter invention of Satan. After all, it came from Muslim lands. Could it really be trusted? Was it a kind of spiritual trap, a demonic brew that would lure Christians away from wine? But here's where the story takes one of those deliciously ironic turns. Pope Clement VIII was asked to weigh in on coffee, and instead of banning it, he tasted it, and he liked it. He supposedly said something along the lines of, "This drink of the Muslims is so delicious that it would be a sin to let only infants drink it," which is one of history's greatest rebrands. Overnight, coffee went from Satan's brew to Christian-approved energy drink. That papal blessing opened the floodgates. By the 1600s, coffeehouses began sprouting across Europe. First in Venice, then in Paris, London, Oxford, Amsterdam. And just as, in Cairo and Istanbul, they became buzzing centers of social life, Europeans walked in, took a sip, and suddenly found themselves wide awake and ready to talk. But here's the key: Europe had been a wine and beer culture for centuries. Breakfast often included weak ale. Lunchtime featured wine. People lived in a fog of low-level alcohol most of the day. And then coffee arrived. Suddenly, instead of drowsy afternoons and sluggish evenings, you had sharp, alert conversations, stretching long into the night. Some historians even argue that coffee helped fuel the Enlightenment, because it literally sobered people up. Instead of debating ideas half-drunk, philosophers and writers were now wide awake, twitching and buzzing with caffeine. And just like in the Ottoman world, authorities didn't love this. Take London. By the mid-1600s, coffeehouses were everywhere. They charged a penny for a cup, which meant that for just 1 coin, you could sit all day, drink coffee, and talk to anyone who walked in. They became known as penny universities because the conversations were as stimulating as any lecture hall. Merchants traded news, scientists debated discoveries, poets recited verses, and yes, ordinary people gossiped endlessly about politics. To a king, this was a nightmare. Imagine walking past a smoky little cafe and hearing 30 people loudly debating whether you were fit to rule. King Charles II, who already had a flair for paranoia, decided he'd had enough. In 1675, he issued a proclamation banning coffeehouses. His reasoning: They were the great resort of idle and disaffected persons. Translation: people who drink coffee talk too much trash about the monarchy, and, as you can guess, the ban lasted about as long as a foam head on an espresso. The backlash was immediate. Londoners loved their coffee houses. They were addicted to the conversation, the caffeine, and the sense of being part of something modern. Within days, the uproar forced Charles II to back down. The coffee houses reopened, and the gossip flowed stronger than ever. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Paris was discovering coffee too. And of course, the French added their own flair. The first Parisian cafes were chic, elegant, places where writers, aristocrats, and fashionable women gathered. Coffee quickly became associated with wit and sophistication. By the 18th century, Parisian cafes were practically breeding grounds for revolution. Voltaire reportedly drank 40 to 50 cups of coffee a day, which might explain why he wrote so much and slept so little. Diderot, Rousseau, all of them haunted the cafes, buzzing with ideas, and caffeine. Amsterdam, too, became a hub of coffee culture. Dutch traders got deeply involved in the coffee trade, planting massive plantations in their colonies, especially Java, which is why we still call coffee Java today. The Dutch didn't just drink coffee. They industrialized it, profited off it, and spread it worldwide. But back to the social side, because that's what really made coffee houses revolutionary. Everywhere they appeared, they became centers of information. Newspapers were read aloud in them. Merchants made deals in them. Politicians were gossiped about in them. The more rulers tried to control public opinion, the more it seemed to leak out in these smoky rooms. And yet, just like in the Ottoman world, the authorities couldn't resist coffee themselves. There's something endearingly human about kings and popes and sultans all trying to ban coffee for the masses while secretly sipping it in their chambers. The hypocrisy was universal. Now, let's slow down here. Picture London in the late 1600s. The streets are muddy. The air is thick with smoke, and the city is still recovering from plague and fire. You step into a coffee house. It's warm, crowded, noisy. Men in wigs are arguing about trade with the colonies. A sailor is bragging about his last voyage. A poet is reciting lines to an unimpressed audience. Cups are clinking. The coffee is bitter and thick, maybe flavored with sugar if you can afford it. It's chaotic, but it's alive. For a penny, you're part of the city's heartbeat. That's the magic of coffee houses. They weren't glamorous, they weren't luxurious, but they offered something more powerful: connection, stimulation, and the sense that you were part of a conversation bigger than yourself. And that, of course, is why rulers hated them. Because once you get people together, caffeinated and opinionated, you can't predict what they'll say. Maybe they'll complain about the price of bread. Maybe they'll debate philosophy. Or maybe they'll quietly start asking whether kings are really necessary at all. By the 1700s, coffee had fully conquered Europe. In some places, like England, it would eventually lose ground to tea, thanks to the British East India Company's obsession with selling leaves instead of beans. But in France, Germany, and beyond, coffee remained the fuel of intellectual life. The Enlightenment, the revolutions, the endless books and pamphlets, all of it brewed, quite literally, in the coffee houses. So, to recap where we are in this sleepy journey, a goat herder in Ethiopia notices his goats acting weird. A few centuries later, half of Europe is buzzing on caffeine, kings are panicking, and philosophers are writing manifestos at 2 in the morning. all because of a bean. And yet, the story doesn't end in Europe, because coffee had one more leap to make. Across the Atlantic, in the New World, coffee would collide with colonialism, slavery, and empire. It would stop being just a curious drink and become one of the most important global commodities of all time. But before we cross that ocean, let's take a slow breath. Imagine yourself sitting in a European cafe in the 1700s. The candlelight flickers, the voices rise and fall, the bitter taste lingers on your tongue. Outside, the city is cold and dark, but in here, it's warm, alive, and buzzing. You could be a merchant, a writer, or just someone who paid a penny for a cup. For a few hours, you belong to the Republic of Coffee, and now we'll drift onward, westward, across the sea, toward the plantations of the Caribbean, the bustling ports of the Americas, and the darker side of coffee's story, the side built not on conversation, but on the backs of enslaved labor. Coffee crosses the ocean so. Let's take a slow breath. We've floated through Mecca, Cairo, Istanbul, Venice, London, Paris, and now the ship is setting sail westward. The sails creak, the sea stretches endlessly, and in the hold of the vessel sacks of coffee beans. By the 1600s and 1700s, Europe wasn't content just to drink coffee. Oh no, they wanted to control it, dominate it, plant it, turn it into profit. And that meant dragging it far from its original homeland and replanting it across the globe, in places where it could be cultivated cheaply, with plenty of human labor force to do the work. The Dutch were the first to figure this out. In the early 1600s, they smuggled coffee plants out of the Arab world. It wasn't easy. For centuries, Yemen had kept a near monopoly by carefully guarding its coffee trees. Exported beans were often boiled first so they couldn't sprout. But Europeans, being Europeans, eventually stole live plants. By 1616, the Dutch had them growing in Amsterdam's botanical gardens. From there, the Dutch moved coffee into their colonies, especially Java in Indonesia. The climate was perfect. The plantations grew, and suddenly, the word Java became shorthand for coffee itself. That's how successful they were. But of course, it wasn't Dutch merchants themselves doing the planting and harvesting. It was forced labor, indigenous people coerced into producing endless beans for the European market, and soon, the French followed. They acquired their own coffee plants. The stories are dramatic, with tales of stolen seeds smuggled in waistcoats, or heroic sailors carrying a single fragile sprout across the ocean. However, it really happened. By the early 1700s, coffee was growing in the Caribbean, Martinique, Saint-Domingue. The French had tropical climates, enslaved labor, and an insatiable demand for caffeine back in Paris. It was the perfect recipe for profit. And here's the darker twist. By the late 1700s, Saint-Domingue, present-day Haiti, had become the largest coffee producer in the world. Coffee, along with sugar, made the colony one of the richest pieces of land on earth. And yet it was built entirely on slavery, brutality, and exhaustion. Enslaved Africans were forced to clear forests, plant fields, pick beans, and process them, all under horrific conditions. Their average life expectancy was shockingly low. Coffee wasn't just a drink of lively conversation in Parisian cafes. It was also a drink of blood and suffering. And this is where history, once again, loves irony. Because while French intellectuals were sitting in Paris, sipping coffee and writing about liberty, equality, and fraternity, the actual production of that coffee depended on one of the most unequal, unfree, and brutal systems in human history. Enlightenment on one end of the cup, chains and whips on the other, and it couldn't last forever. In 1791, the enslaved population of Saint-Domingue rose up in the Haitian Revolution. It was long, brutal, and world-changing. And when Haiti declared independence in 1804, the massive French coffee empire there collapsed. Suddenly, the richest coffee colony on earth was gone. Plantation owners fled. The global supply shifted, and Haiti became both a beacon of freedom and a nation punished for daring to escape Europe's grip. Meanwhile, coffee spread elsewhere in the Americas. Brazil would soon become the giant, the absolute titan of the coffee world. By the 1800s, Brazil's climate, soil, and endless supply of enslaved labor made it the perfect coffee engine. And so, Brazilian beans began to flood the global market. Entire regions of the country were transformed into coffee plantations. Forests were cut down, indigenous populations displaced, enslaved Africans shipped in vast numbers. Coffee was no longer just a luxury drink. It was becoming one of the world's most important commodities, and Brazil stayed on top for a long, long time. Even today, it's still one of the largest producers. But in those early centuries, its dominance was absolute. Every cup of coffee in London, Paris, New York, most likely Brazilian. Every late-night philosopher scribbling in a cafe, sipping Brazil. Every bleary-eyed worker gulping a morning brew. Brazil again. It's worth pausing here, because coffee had gone through such a transformation. Think of it. A shepherd boy in Ethiopia notices his goats dancing. Centuries later, empires are enslaving millions to produce the beans. A drink that began as a mystical, almost spiritual experience, had turned into the fuel of global capitalism. The irony practically writes itself. But let's keep drifting. In North America, coffee also took root in culture, but in a slightly different way. The American colonies had been tea drinkers at first, like their British rulers. But after a certain incident involving tea, taxes, and a harbor in Boston, tea suddenly wasn't fashionable anymore. Coffee, by contrast, became the patriotic drink. During the American Revolution, drinking coffee was practically an act of defiance. By the 19th century, coffee had cemented itself as the national drink of the United States, and Americans didn't just drink it, they drank it in industrial quantities. Soldiers carried coffee during the Civil War. Pioneers brewed it on the frontier. Cowboys boiled it over campfires. The American image of coffee wasn't a chic Parisian cafe. It was a tin mug, a rough brew, strong enough to keep you awake through battle or farming or a long night on the trail. Coffee became woven into the myth of America itself, hard-working, restless, never quite sleeping. Meanwhile, the European empires kept expanding coffee production in their colonies. The British in India and Ceylon, the Spanish in Central America. Coffee became a global network, rooted in forced labor, colonial control, and eventually wage exploitation even after slavery was abolished. Whole economies in Central and South America were reshaped around coffee exports. El Salvador, Costa Rica, Colombia, Guatemala, all of them tied their futures to beans. And of course, foreign investors and companies took a big slice of the profits. And with that came politics. Coffee elites, wealthy landowners who controlled plantations, became the ruling classes in many of these countries. In Central America, they were sometimes called coffee barons. They didn't just grow beans. They controlled governments, armies, and entire societies. In El Salvador, for example, coffee elites dominated politics for more than a century. In Brazil, they shaped the republic. In Colombia, coffee shaped the very identity of the nation. All this from a drink that, not too long ago, was considered suspicious and possibly satanic. History has a sense of humor. Let's zoom out and look at what coffee had become by the 19th century. It was everywhere. It was the drink of writers, workers, soldiers, and revolutionaries. It was the engine of entire colonial economies. It was both a symbol of sophistication and a symbol of rugged survival. And it carried, in every cup, the weight of exploitation. You could sit in a London coffeehouse and hear stock prices read aloud, while across the ocean, enslaved laborers bent over in a Brazilian field made that very cup possible. You could sip espresso in Paris while philosophers debated liberty, while in Haiti, enslaved people were fighting to the death for that very liberty. Coffee was, and still is, the great connector and the great contradiction. And yet, despite all this darkness, people loved it. They couldn't stop drinking it. The addiction was too strong, the ritual too comforting. Morning coffee became sacred. Evening coffee became social. The world had built itself, quite literally, on beans. So now, as we near the end of our slow walk through coffee's history, we've reached the point where it is fully global. No longer just an Ethiopian curiosity, or an Arabian monopoly, or a Venetian luxury. By the 19th century, it was everyone's drink, from kings to workers, from Europe to the Americas, from chic cafes to muddy frontier camps. And still, the story wasn't finished. Because in the 20th century, coffee would take on new forms. Again, instant coffee, global brands, advertising campaigns that turned it into not just a drink, but a lifestyle. Coffee would become as much about identity as it was about caffeine. But that we'll save for another drift through history. For now, let's leave ourselves with one image: a cup of coffee steaming gently. Behind it, centuries of farmers, traders, enslaved workers, philosophers, smugglers, kings, and rebels. All of them, in some way, connected to that one simple cup. It's bitter, it's sweet, it's complicated, just like history itself. Coffee gets modern, weird, and corporate so. Here we are. The world is caffeinated. By the late 19th century, coffee is no longer a novelty. It's an everyday drink for millions. But the story doesn't stop there. Because in the 20th century, coffee goes through another transformation. It becomes faster, cheaper, more commercial, and, eventually, more hipster. And, like always, history manages to keep it both tragic and absurd. Let's start with the early 1900s. Coffee is already the fuel of Europe and the Americas. But industry wants to make it even more accessible. Enter instant coffee. The first versions of instant coffee appeared in the late 19th century, but it was in the early 1900s that it started gaining traction. In 1901, a Japanese-American chemist named Satoru Kato introduced a soluble coffee powder. At the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, people thought it was neat, but it didn't take off immediately. Still, the idea was floating around. By Itenjo by Senshaba, Nestle had perfected it with Nescafe, which became an instant hit. Why? Because it was cheap, it was quick, and you didn't need a fancy setup to make it. And then came World War II. If there's one thing soldiers love, it's caffeine. Armies quickly adopted instant coffee as a staple. The US military packed it into ration kits. Soldiers drank it in muddy trenches, on ships, in foxholes. For many, it became a daily survival tool. After the war, those same soldiers came home and kept drinking it. Instant coffee exploded in popularity. It was marketed as modern, efficient, perfect for the fast-paced, industrial 20th century. Of course, instant coffee was also terrible. If you've ever had the misfortune of drinking it, you know, it's weak, bitter, vaguely chemical. But it was easy, and that was enough. Millions of households switched from brewing pots of coffee to spooning powder into hot water. It was the age of convenience, and taste was a distant afterthought. Now, while instant coffee took over in many countries, especially Britain and the US, there were still places that clung to tradition. Italy, for example. The Italians decided to take coffee in the opposite direction. They invented the espresso machine in the early 1900s, and by mid-century, espresso culture was booming. Small cups of strong, rich coffee became the centerpiece of Italian cafes. It was quick, yes, but it was also about flavor, ritual, and style. While Americans were chugging watery instant coffee, Italians were savoring thick, golden crema, and slowly, espresso culture spread outward. By the 1950s and 60s, European cafes were becoming symbols of sophistication, especially in places like Paris and Vienna. The cafe was no longer just a place to gossip or read newspapers. It was now also a place of existentialist brooding. You could sit in a smoky cafe, sip a tiny cup, and look extremely thoughtful while saying something like, "Life is meaningless." Coffee fueled entire philosophical movements, or at least gave them a cozy backdrop. Meanwhile, in America, something else was brewing. By the mid-20th century, coffee was part of daily life, but it wasn't exactly glamorous. Think drip coffee. In a diner, bottomless refills. Pots sitting on hot plates for hours. The taste didn't matter. What mattered was that you could drink it by the gallon. Coffee was the fuel of truckers, factory workers, office clerks, and suburban parents. It wasn't fancy. It was just there. But of course, marketing companies couldn't leave it at that. In the 1950s and 60s, coffee advertising exploded. Jingles, smiling housewives serving steaming cups, slogans about energy and hospitality. Coffee was sold as the heart of the American home. Drink coffee, be a good host. Drink coffee, keep your husband happy. Drink coffee, stay productive at work. It wasn't just a beverage anymore. It was a cultural necessity. And then came the late 20th century. This is where things got weird. In the 1970s, a small shop opened in Seattle. It sold beans, not cups. But in the 1980s, under new leadership, that shop transformed into something much bigger. You may have heard of it, Starbucks. Starbucks didn't just sell coffee, it sold an experience, a lifestyle, a third place, as they called it. Not home, not work, but somewhere in between. They took the Italian espresso tradition, Americanized it, supersized it, and gave it names that confused everyone at first. Grande, Venti, Frappuccino. What did those words even mean? It didn't matter. People bought them suddenly. Coffee wasn't just about waking up. It was about identity. You weren't just drinking coffee. You were a latte person, a cappuccino person, a caramel macchiato person. Coffee became branded, personalized, elevated. Starbucks cafes multiplied like mushrooms, spreading across cities, suburbs, airports, and eventually the entire world. And here's the funny thing. For centuries, coffeehouses had been places of rebellion, suspicious, even dangerous, in Mecca. In London, in Paris, authorities worried about the conversations happening inside. Now, coffeehouses were branded chains playing soft jazz, offering Wi-Fi and charging $5 a cup. The rebellious outlaw cafes of the 1500s had morphed into corporate living rooms, safe, sanitized, but still buzzing with caffeine. But Starbucks wasn't alone. Coffee culture diversified everywhere. In the 1990s and 2000s, the so-called second wave of coffee brought attention back to quality. Espresso bars, independent, roasters, fair trade movements. And by the 2010s, the third wave was in full swing. Artisanal coffee, single origin beans, baristas who could lecture you for 20 minutes about soil composition. Suddenly, coffee was no longer just a drink. It was a craft, a science, a hipster badge of honor. And of course, the irony remained. Behind the latte art and the fair trade certifications, coffee production still relied on labor in the global South, often poorly paid, often precarious. Farmers in Brazil, Ethiopia, Colombia, and Vietnam worked long hours for very little. The old colonial dynamics never fully disappeared. They were just dressed up in new packaging. That $6 oat milk latte in Brooklyn still connected back to a farmer picking cherries on the other side of the world. And speaking of Vietnam, let's not forget its rise. In the late 20th century, Vietnam became one of the world's top coffee producers, thanks to government programs and global demand. Today, it's second only to Brazil. And while much of its production goes into cheap instant coffee, Vietnam also developed its own unique coffee culture. Strong brews mixed with condensed milk or even egg yolk. A reminder that coffee is endlessly adaptable, endlessly local, even as it's global now. Let's glide into the present. Today, coffee is, well, everywhere. It's the morning ritual of billions. It's the reason so many of us manage to function at all. It's in fancy cafes, vending machines, drive-through windows, and high-tech espresso makers sitting on kitchen counters. It fuels CEOs, students, artists, night shift workers, and yes, late-night YouTube historians. And it's still divisive. Some people are purists, espresso only, no sugar, no milk. Others drink pumpkin spice lattes topped with whipped cream and sprinkles. Some prefer Turkish coffee, thick and sludgy at the bottom of the cup. Others want cold brew steeped for 12 hours. Coffee, in all its forms, has become a global language. Everyone drinks it differently, but everyone drinks it so. As we close this long, sleepy journey, let's reflect for a moment. Coffee began as a mystical plant in Ethiopia. Discovered, so the story goes, by a shepherd watching his goats dance. It spread to Sufi mystics in Yemen, who used it to stay awake in prayer. It spread to Mecca, Cairo, and Istanbul, where authorities tried and failed to shut down rebellious cafes. It sailed to Venice, London, and Paris, where it fueled science, stock markets, revolutions, and gossip. It crossed oceans to the Americas, where it was built on slavery and empire. It became the patriotic drink of the US, the economic backbone of Brazil, the obsession of philosophers, and the addiction of soldiers. It turned into instant powder in a tin, then into billion-dollar lattes with names in Italian, and through it all, it stayed the same in one essential way. It kept people awake. It kept them talking, thinking, writing, working. It was always fuel, whether for rebellion, for profit, or just for getting out of bed in the morning. So tonight, as you listen to this quiet ramble, maybe with a cup of coffee on the nightstand, hopefully decaf at this hour, remember that your drink has carried with it centuries of history, the joys and tragedies of empires, the lives of millions of workers, the dreams of thinkers. and the routines of ordinary people. It's just a cup of coffee, but it's also a whole world. And with that, let's set the cup down, close our eyes, and drift into sleep. Coffee oddities, rituals, and sleepy side roads. So, we've taken coffee across centuries, across oceans, across dynasties and revolutions. But before we tuck it in for good, it feels right to wander through some of the stranger little corners of its story, because coffee, like all human obsessions, attracts odd traditions, silly rules, and more than a few contradictions. Let's start in Scandinavia. You might not expect it, but the Nordic countries are among the heaviest coffee drinkers in the world. Finland, especially, per capita, they drink more than anyone else, averaging about 4 cups per person per day, which, given the long winters and the endless darkness, makes sense. You need something to survive 6 hours of daylight in December. Coffee is less a drink there and more like a blanket. Warm, reliable, everywhere. And, in classic Nordic fashion, they developed their own unique twist. Egg, coffee. Yes, egg. The method goes like this. You crack a raw egg into the coffee grounds before brewing, then add hot water. The egg helps filter. The grounds supposedly clarifies the flavor and leaves a smooth, mild cup. It sounds strange, but it's been a tradition for generations. It's especially common in Lutheran communities in the US Midwest, where Scandinavian immigrants brought it along. So, if you ever find yourself in Minnesota, don't be surprised if someone offers you an egg coffee. Now, swing over to Ethiopia again, where it all began. In many Ethiopian households, the traditional coffee ceremony is still alive. It's not just about drinking, it's a social ritual. The beans are roasted right there in front of you, filling the room with smoke. They're ground, brewed, and served in small cups, often 3 rounds in a row. It's slow, deliberate, almost meditative. Compared to the quick slurp of a Starbucks drive-thru, it feels like stepping into another world. A reminder that coffee wasn't always about rushing. Sometimes it was about slowing down. Meanwhile, in Vienna, coffee culture got its own flair. Austrian cafes became famous not just for the coffee, but for the pastries, the marble tables, the newspapers on little wooden racks. The Viennese coffee house became a symbol of intellectual life, a place where writers, musicians, and students lingered for hours. It wasn't just tolerated, it was encouraged. There's even an old saying, if you sit in a Viennese cafe long enough, the whole world will pass by. And then, of course, there's Turkey. Turkish coffee is so strong it practically qualifies as a food group, thick, unfiltered, sweetened to the point of syrup. It's less about sipping and more about bracing yourself. But beyond the taste, Turkish coffee has an unusual tradition, fortune-telling. After you drink, the cup is turned upside down, and the patterns left in the grounds are read for clues about your future. Love, money, travel, betrayal, all hidden in the swirls of sludge at the bottom of the cup. Coffee, in this case, isn't just fuel, it's prophecy. And speaking of prophecy, let's not forget the endless health debates. Since the 1600s, doctors and moralists have been arguing about whether coffee is good or bad for you. At first, they called it a dangerous drug. Then it was praised as a miracle. Then condemned again. Then rescued again. Even today, you'll see headlines. Coffee will save your life, followed by coffee will kill you. It's apparently both an antioxidant wonder and a heart-destroying poison, depending on the week. The truth, of course, is somewhere in between. Too much will leave you jittery. None at all will make you miserable. Moderation is, as usual, the boring answer. Now, here's a small detour. The Swedish king Gustav III once staged a bizarre experiment to prove that coffee was deadly. He took two identical twins who had been sentenced to death instead of execution. He commuted their sentences on the condition that one drink 3 pots of coffee every day, while the other drank 3 pots of tea. Doctors monitored them. The king waited for coffee to kill. Instead, both doctors died before the twins did. The tea drinker lived into his 80s. The coffee drinker outlived him. Gustav himself was assassinated before the experiment finished. In other words, coffee survived everyone, which brings us back, in a way, to the bigger picture. Coffee has always outlasted its critics. No matter how many bans, sermons, experiments, or warnings, people just kept drinking it. Because, honestly, it works. It wakes you up. It keeps you talking. It softens the edge of long nights and early mornings. People cling to that, generation after generation. And yet, as much as coffee is about energy, it's also about quiet. Think of the moments. A single cup in the morning before the world begins. A late-night brew while studying. A sleepy chat with a friend over a shared pot. Coffee doesn't just stimulate, it comforts. It creates pauses, excuses to sit, to linger. Even in the most hurried cultures, coffee still carves out small islands of time. So, as we close this epilogue, maybe it's fitting to think of coffee not just as history, but as presence. It's the small thing in the background of so many lives, the goats dancing on a hillside, the Sufis chanting through the night, the students scribbling in Paris, the soldiers clutching tin cups, the office worker slumped at a desk, the hipster photographing latte art, all of them tied together by this same bitter little bean. And maybe, just maybe, you too, sitting here, listening, maybe with a cup nearby, maybe empty, maybe cold, or maybe you're just letting the story itself be your lullaby. Either way, the history of coffee has done its job. It's kept you awake just long enough. And now, as we drift away from outlaw cafes, from Ottoman bands, from instant tins, from giant green mermaid logos, it's time to let the story cool down. Take one last sip, set it down, and let sleep take over. The quiet echoes of coffee. So, we've gone through centuries of drama, bans, revolutions, and cafe culture. But coffee stories have this way of lingering, like the smell that hangs in the room long after the cup is empty. Let's sit with a few more before the lights go out. One of my favorites is from 18th century England. There was a pamphlet war. Yes, pamphlet war, over whether coffee was ruining marriages. The claim was that men were spending too much time in coffeehouses, sipping away their vigor, gossiping with other men, and abandoning their wives. One critic even called coffee the ruin of virility, which, honestly, sounds more like projection than science. Still, the idea that a drink could be accused of ending masculinity tells you how nervous people were about change. The reality, of course, was that men just enjoyed having a spot where women weren't invited. They called them penny universities, and sometimes the tuition was a broken marriage. Meanwhile, over in Prussia, Frederick the Great wasn't a fan of coffee either. He thought it was unpatriotic because it pulled people away from drinking good old German beer. He went so far as to declare that coffee imports should be restricted, and he ordered state officials to promote beer for breakfast. Imagine rolling out of bed at 6 in the morning and your king insists that your daily starter is a pint of ale, not a mug of coffee. The people politely ignored him, of course. Coffee had already won. Jump over to France, and you'll find Voltaire, one of the Enlightenment's sharpest wits, living almost entirely on coffee. Supposedly, he drank up to 50 cups a day. Though cup back then was smaller than the mugs we know, it's still absurd. He credited it for his energy and focus. Doctors warned him constantly that it would kill him. Instead, he lived into his 80s, proof that sarcasm and caffeine make a surprisingly sustainable diet. In America, coffee became a patriotic act. After the Boston Tea Party, tea carried the stigma of loyalty to Britain. Coffee, on the other hand, was framed as a revolutionary's drink. Thomas Jefferson even called it the favorite drink of the civilized world, which, if you read between the lines, basically meant tea is for Tories. So when you sip coffee in the US, you're participating in a little echo of rebellion. Let's drift east again for a moment. In Japan, coffee had a slower start. Tea culture was already so deeply embedded that coffee seemed unnecessary, but by the late 19th century, modern cafes called Kiseton began appearing in Tokyo. They weren't just about coffee, but also about jazz, books, and intellectual chatter. Over time, Japanese coffee culture grew its own character. Meticulous, precise, almost ritualistic. The pour-over, which feels trendy now, was perfected there decades ago. They turned coffee into a craft of patience, proving once again that this drink bends itself to the habits of any culture it enters. And then, of course, there are the strange preparations. We already met Scandinavian egg coffee. But what about butter coffee? Long before Silicon Valley entrepreneurs rebranded it as bulletproof coffee, people in Tibet were mixing yak butter into tea. And in parts of Ethiopia, butter was sometimes added to coffee for extra richness. It's heavy, warming, and frankly less ridiculous than it sounds, though maybe not something you'd want right before bed, which brings us, gently, to the whole paradox of coffee at bedtime. It's almost comical that we're talking about one of the world's strongest stimulants in a context designed to help you sleep. But that's sort of the magic. Coffee isn't just about the caffeine. It's about the ritual, the comfort, the sense of continuity. Even if you don't drink it right now, hearing its story works like the aroma itself. Lingering, familiar, soothing in its own odd way. Because the truth is, coffee has always been a contradiction. It's a drink that wakes people up, but it's also the backdrop to some of our quietest moments. It's a global commodity worth billions, and yet it starts with a single small seed. It's been outlawed, feared, and demonized, but also worshipped, celebrated, and woven into identity. It's simple, it's complicated, it's ordinary, and it's extraordinary, all at once. So if the room around you is dim now, and your eyes are heavy, maybe that's the best way to finish, with contradictions. Unresolved cups unfinished, stories trailing off into the dark. Coffee will still be there in the morning. It always is. Last sips. We've been wandering for hours now, following coffee through goat fields, smoky Meccan courtyards, Ottoman edicts, Enlightenment salons, colonial trade routes, Scandinavian kitchens, and chain store empires. And yet, there's always one more little story, one more stray detail clinging to the rim. Coffee has that effect. You think you're finished, but then just one more sip, like the fact that Pope Clement VIII, back in the 1600s, supposedly baptized coffee. Some church officials wanted it banned as a Muslim drink, a suspiciously exotic temptation. But the Pope tried a cup, liked it, and declared that it was too delicious to be left to non-Christians alone. Whether the story is true or just apocryphal, It captures the way coffee disarms its critics. Most people who fought against it eventually caved once they actually tasted it. Or consider Brazil. Now, one of the largest producers, its coffee empire supposedly started with a smuggled handful of seeds hidden in a bouquet. In 1727, a Portuguese officer named Francisco de Melo Palheta was sent to French Guiana, officially to settle a border dispute. Unofficially, he was tasked with acquiring coffee plants. He charmed the governor's wife, who sent him off with a bouquet of flowers and tucked inside the contraband seeds. From that tiny act of botanical smuggling grew Brazil's coffee dominance. A whole country's economy sprouted from a flirt and a flower arrangement. And then there's Italy, where coffee evolved into espresso. Small, concentrated, strong enough to jolt a statue awake. The word itself means pressed out, a quick shot rather than a long sit. Ironically though, Italians don't rush it. They sip at the bar, standing, lingering in conversation. The paradox again, fast coffee, slow moment. In the US, the advertising world took coffee into stranger territory. Mid-century ads promised housewives that serving the right brand of coffee would save their marriages. Instant coffee was marketed as modern and liberating, yet the same commercials mocked women for not brewing it properly. Coffee became less about flavor and more about performance, a small stage for anxieties about gender and domestic life. Proof that even a drink can be tangled in cultural guilt trips. And just in case we thought the royal bans were ancient history, in 2018, the country of Kenya briefly floated the idea of prohibiting public servants from drinking coffee during working hours, arguing that it reduced efficiency, which is like banning shoes for slowing down running. Needless to say, it didn't stick. Coffee bans never do. So here we are, after all the detours, down to the dregs of the cup. If you've made it this far, you've essentially shared a long evening sitting across a table, listening to the life story of a bean, from outlaw stimulant to everyday comfort, from scandal to routine, from rebellion to morning commute. And what lingers isn't just the drink itself, but the rhythm it's created for centuries. Gather, pour, sip, talk, wait, repeat. Over and over, across cultures and eras, people have been doing the same simple thing. Coffee becomes less about the caffeine and more about that shared pause. Even if the pause is happening right now, between you and a sleepy voice drifting through your headphones. So let's leave it there. The cups are empty. The stories are told. The cafe is closing. The lights are low. Coffee has done its work, not to keep you awake this time, but maybe to ease you into rest. Good night.